Paris, early morning, 1965. Inside a guarded vault, heavy doors swing open. Wooden crates stamped with banking seals sit ready on steel pallets. They are not weapons. They are not art. They are gold. And they are leaving. Across the Atlantic, officials in Washington are already uneasy. This transfer is legal. It follows the rules. But it is dangerous. Because once gold starts moving, confidence starts moving with it. And confidence, not armies, is what holds monetary empires together. No treaty has been broken. No alliance has collapsed. Yet something fundamental is cracking beneath the surface of the post-war world. This is not a story about betrayal in public. It is a story about trust, quietly withdrawn. To understand why these shipments mattered, you have to go back to the end of the Second World War. When the global financial system was redesigned under American leadership. In 1944, representatives from dozens of countries gathered to build a framework that would prevent another depression and another monetary free-for-all. What emerged was a system based on fixed exchange rates, anchored to the US dollar, and the dollar, in turn, was anchored to gold. On paper, it was elegant. Other currencies would be tied to the dollar. The dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed price. Stability would follow. Trade would recover. Confidence would return. But there was an unspoken assumption at the heart of the system. That the United States would always have enough gold to back the dollars it issued. And that its allies would never test that promise too aggressively. For years, it worked. The United States emerged from the war with the largest gold reserves in the world and an economy untouched by destruction. Europe needed dollars to rebuild. American exports flowed outward. Gold flowed inward. Washington became not just a political leader, but the financial center of gravity for the Western world. Yet success planted the seeds of strain. By the late 1950s, the global situation had changed. Europe had recovered faster than expected. Industrial output returned. Trade balances shifted. Dollars were no longer scarce. They were everywhere. And that raised an uncomfortable question. If every dollar could, in theory, be exchanged for gold, did the United States actually have enough gold to honor that promise? Officials in Washington understood the risk. Quietly, they began to manage perception. Gold reserves were guarded closely. Data was framed carefully. Confidence became a policy objective in its own right. But allies were not blind. In London and Paris, economists noticed the imbalance growing. The United States was running persistent deficits. Dollars were accumulating overseas faster than gold was accumulating in American vaults. The system depended on restraint, on countries choosing not to redeem dollars for gold, even when they could. For a time, that restraint held. Then politics intervened. In France, a new leadership took a harder view of monetary sovereignty. The idea that global finance should revolve permanently around the dollar was no longer seen as neutral or inevitable. It was seen as a form of leverage, a privilege enjoyed by one country, paid for by all others. Publicly, France spoke of stability. Privately, it acted. Requests were made to convert dollars into gold. Not as an attack, not as a threat, simply as a right guaranteed under the rules of the system. Each request was small. Each shipment followed protocol. But together, they carried a message that could not be ignored. Gold was leaving the United States. British officials watched closely. The United Kingdom had its own reasons for caution. Sterling's role as a global currency had already been weakened by post-war debt and repeated crises. The dollar system offered stability, but it also imposed dependence. If confidence in the dollar faltered, everyone would feel it. This was the first major turning point. What had been a cooperative system began to reveal its competitive underside. The same rules that created trust could be used to apply pressure. Gold withdrawals were not just financial transactions. They were signals. They said, "We are watching, we are counting, and we are no longer certain." Inside Washington, the response was conflicted. Some argued for accommodation. Others feared that yielding would encourage more withdrawals. The deeper fear was contagion. If one major ally converted dollars into gold, others might follow. And if they did, the arithmetic was unforgiving. There was not enough gold. The United States still spoke the language of partnership, still emphasized shared interests, still presented the dollar as a neutral instrument of global growth. But behind closed doors, a different conversation had begun, one about limits, control, and how to defend a system that could not survive full transparency. This was not yet a war. There were no sanctions, no speeches denouncing allies, no dramatic breaks. But the rules were being tested, and once tested, they could not return to their original innocence. By the mid-1960s, the gold question had moved from abstract theory to daily concern. Each shipment, each request, each balance sheet forced a reckoning. The United States could either allow the system to function exactly as promised or change the promise itself. That choice had not yet been made, but the quiet gold war had begun. By the late 1960s, the strain was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. It was visible. And inside Washington, it was becoming urgent. The United States still claimed to guarantee the dollar's convertibility into gold at a fixed price. Officially, nothing had changed. The rules of the post-war system remained intact. But behind the scenes, policy had shifted from confidence building to damage control. The core problem was simple and brutal. The world held far more dollars than the United States held gold. Every additional dollar circulating overseas increased the risk that the promise would be tested, and every test reduced the margin for error. American officials understood that they were no longer defending a balanced system. They were defending time. One response was coordination. Quiet agreements were made among major central banks to limit gold conversions. Public unity was emphasized. Private restraint was encouraged. This informal cooperation was meant to preserve stability without rewriting the rules outright. But coordination required trust, and trust was already thinning. In Europe, the recovery of the post-war years had given governments new leverage. They no longer depended entirely on American capital. Their trade balances improved. Their reserves grew. And with that growth came questions about why the global system should remain anchored permanently to one country's currency. France pushed hardest. French officials argued that the system had drifted away from its original purpose. Instead of preventing imbalance, it now enabled it. The United States could finance overseas commitments by issuing dollars, while others had to earn them. Gold convertibility, in theory, was the safeguard. In practice, it was being discouraged. So France continued to act within the rules, while exposing their weakness. Gold shipments continued. Each one was handled discreetly. No speeches, no grandstanding, just formal requests and quiet transfers. But the symbolism was impossible to miss. Allies were no longer content to hold paper claims indefinitely. The British position was more cautious, but no less concerned. Britain's own currency had suffered repeated crises since the war. Officials knew how quickly confidence could evaporate once markets sensed vulnerability. They watched the gold movements, not as spectators, but as participants in a system whose failure would hit them hard. As gold flowed out, Washington's options narrowed. Raising interest rates could attract capital, but risk slowing the domestic economy. Cutting overseas spending could reduce deficits, but carried political costs during a tense global standoff. Revaluing gold, raising its official price, might restore balance temporarily, but would signal weakness and invite further pressure. Every option had consequences. None were clean. Inside the U.S. Treasury and central banking circles, a new reality took hold. The problem was no longer how to preserve the system indefinitely. It was how to exit without triggering panic. That realization marked the second turning point. Instead of defending convertibility at all costs, American policy shifted toward controlling access. Administrative measures were introduced to discourage gold outflows. Special arrangements were made with friendly governments. Market signals were managed. Information was filtered. Outwardly, the dollar remained as good as gold. Internally, it was treated as something that needed protection from its own promise. This quiet contradiction created tension with allies. Publicly, they were told the system was sound. Privately, they encountered resistance when they tried to use the rights they had been guaranteed. The gap between principle and practice widened. Confidence, once lost, does not disappear evenly. It fractures. Some countries reduced their exposure quietly. Others hesitated, fearing that acting first would trigger blame or retaliation. Everyone watched everyone else. The system became less about rules and more about timing. By the end of the decade, the gold stock of the United States had fallen sharply from its post-war peak. The trend was unmistakable. Even without a full-scale run, the direction was clear. The United States could not honor unlimited conversion forever. At the same time, domestic pressures mounted, social spending rose, military commitments expanded. The political appetite for austerity was limited. Issuing dollars was easier than making cuts. And as long as the rest of the world accepted those dollars, the problem could be postponed. Postponed but not solved. Allies began to sense that the arrangement was asymmetrical. They bore the risk of holding dollars. The United States bore the risk of losing gold. But only one side could unilaterally change the rules. That imbalance reshaped relationships. What had once been a cooperative monetary order now felt like a system managed for survival. Trust was replaced by calculation. Each decision was weighed not just for its economic impact, but for its signal. The Gold War remained quiet. But it was no longer subtle. The question was no longer whether the system would break. It was who would move first and who would absorb the shock when it did. By the early 1970 seconds, the system was no longer under pressure. It was breaking. The warning signs were everywhere. Even if they were carefully downplayed, gold reserves continued to thin. Foreign dollar holdings continued to grow, and the gap between promise and reality widened into something dangerous. What made this moment different was speed. Confidence, once cracked, began to move faster than policy. Currency markets reacted in hours, not months. Capital shifted across borders at a scale the original system had never been designed to handle. The structure built in the calm aftermath of war was now facing a world of instant transactions and political uncertainty. The United States faced a choice it had avoided for years: defend gold convertibility fully and accept severe domestic consequences, or abandon it and accept that the global monetary order would change overnight. Behind closed doors, the debate was no longer abstract. Officials reviewed the numbers in stark terms. If large holders converted their dollars all at once, the gold stock would be drained rapidly. The promise that anchored the system would collapse in public, not quietly. That outcome was unacceptable. At the same time, allies were growing bolder. Some openly questioned why the burden of adjustment always fell on those holding dollars, not on those issuing them. Others prepared contingency plans in case the dollar faltered. The cooperative language of Bretton Woods gave way to strategic positioning. The breaking point came when pressure converged from multiple directions at once. Rising inflation at home weakened confidence abroad. Trade imbalances deepened. Speculation against the dollar intensified. Gold conversions accelerated. The system was being tested not by enemies, but by partners acting rationally within the rules. That was the bitter irony. In response, American leadership chose decisiveness over delay. The conclusion was blunt: preserving control mattered more than preserving the promise. The decision itself was made quickly. Its consequences were vast. Gold convertibility would be suspended, not debated internationally, not renegotiated in advance, simply ended. When the announcement came, it was framed as temporary, a protective measure, a necessary step to stabilize markets. The language was careful, almost reassuring, but the reality was unmistakable. The anchor was gone. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the dollar was no longer tied to gold. It floated on trust alone, backed by economic power, political influence, and military reach, but not by a fixed exchange guarantee. Allies were stunned. Some had suspected this outcome. Few expected it to arrive so abruptly. Years of quiet restraint, careful coordination, and diplomatic signaling ended in a unilateral act. The Gold War ended not with a negotiation, but with a closure. For countries that had relied on the system's stability, the impact was immediate. Exchange rates shifted, trade calculations changed. Reserve strategies were rewritten. Central banks scrambled to adapt to a world without a fixed reference point. For those who had pushed hardest for reform, the outcome was mixed. The imbalance they had criticized was resolved, but not in their favor. The issuer of the world's dominant currency had simply removed the constraint. The system did not collapse into chaos. It transformed. Currencies began to float. Markets gained influence over exchange values. Monetary policy became a tool of national strategy rather than international agreement. And the dollar, despite predictions of decline, remained central. This was the final paradox of the crisis. The act that many believed would weaken American power ultimately reshaped it. Freed from gold, the dollar became more flexible, more responsive, and over time, more entrenched. Those who had exchanged dollars for gold in the final years preserved value. Those who continued to hold dollars adapted to a new reality. The cost was not paid equally. Some economies absorbed volatility. Others lost leverage. The promise of a stable, rules-based order was replaced by a system driven by markets and managed by power. The breaking point revealed the truth beneath the post-war system. It had never been purely neutral. It had been anchored to strength. And when that strength chose to move, the world moved with it. The quiet gold war ended not with winners and losers clearly defined, but with a new hierarchy, written not in treaties, but in currency flows. In the years that followed, the world adjusted to a reality it had not chosen but could not reverse. The end of gold convertibility did not bring immediate collapse. There were no closed banks, no frozen trade lanes, no visible panic on the streets. Instead, the consequences unfolded slowly, quietly, and permanently. A new monetary era had begun. Currencies floated. Exchange rates moved daily. Governments learned to live with volatility rather than certainty. What had once been fixed by agreement was now shaped by markets, confidence, and power. For the United States, the outcome was unexpectedly favorable. Freed from the obligation to defend gold reserves, economic policy gained flexibility. Deficits could be financed without immediate external constraint. Monetary tools could be used aggressively in response to domestic pressures. The dollar no longer promised conversion, it demanded trust, and the world continued to give it. Despite anger, despite frustration, despite warnings of decline, the dollar remained central to global trade. Oil was priced in it. Debt was issued in it. Reserves were still held in it. There was no alternative large enough, liquid enough, or stable enough to replace it. This was not an accident. American financial markets deepened. Political alliances reinforced usage. Military reach underpinned confidence. The dollar became not a promise of gold, but a claim on an entire system of power. For former allies, the adjustment was harder. Those who had once relied on fixed rates now faced currency swings that affected exports, wages, and debt. Planning became more complex. Economic shocks traveled faster. Monetary independence came with new risks. Some adapted quickly. Others paid the price. Europe moved toward deeper integration, seeking stability through coordination rather than convertibility. New institutions emerged. New currencies were imagined. But the lesson of the gold crisis lingered. Sovereignty in finance was fragile. For France and Britain, the quiet Gold War marked the end of an era. Their post-war influence over global monetary rules faded. They became participants rather than architects. The center of gravity had shifted decisively across the Atlantic. What made this transformation so profound was its silence. There was no formal end to the post-war order. No conference declaring its conclusion. No treaty signing away gold. The change arrived through necessity, pressure, and unilateral choice. History often remembers dramatic moments. This one hid in plain sight. The gold withdrawals of the 1,960 seconds were not acts of hostility. They were rational responses to imbalance. The response to those withdrawals was not aggression. It was control. Together, they exposed a simple truth. International systems endure only as long as power and interest align. When they diverge, rules bend. When pressure builds, promises break. The Gold War did not make the United States stronger overnight. But it revealed how strength operates, not through confrontation, but through options. The ability to change the rules mattered more than adherence to them. That lesson did not go unnoticed. Future crises would follow a similar pattern. Confidence tested. Constraints questioned. Decisions made behind closed doors. And outcomes framed as temporary, even when they were permanent. The world that emerged was more flexible, but less predictable. Markets gained influence. Speculation became force. Currency values reflected sentiment as much as substance. And yet, the system held, not because it was fair, not because it was equal, but because it was anchored to the largest economy, the deepest markets, and the most powerful state. That was the final outcome of the quiet Gold War. Allies learned that trust without leverage is fragile. Power learned that flexibility is control, and the dollar learned it no longer needed gold to rule. It needed belief, and belief, once established, proved far harder to drain than any vault of metal.